You're someone with a vision for your practice, for your side hustle, and for your personal journey. But when it comes to establishing your path on how to get to where you want to be with your practice, things get a little messy. You're also someone who'd prefer to go in person instead of to groups and listening to everyone else's story. To me, it sounds like you could benefit from one-on-one consulting with our experienced practice of the practice consultants. From $5.95 a month and up, you can work with a consultant that will give you more direction and practical tried and tested tips matched to you and your goals. For more information, visit practiceofthepractice.com/apply. Again, that's practiceofthepractice.com/apply. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 1307. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast. You know, it's funny, after 1,300 episodes, I stumbled on that 1,307, just kind of gasped a little bit, like, wow, we hit 1,300 already. How'd we get here? So really excited to have you on the show. If you've never listened to this show before, this is the place where we talk about building a thriving private practice you absolutely love. But as well, we've been talking about all sorts of other issues in the world. We've talked about the rise of fascism lately. We've talked about all sorts of political things in the world. One thing we haven't really dug into, though, is climate change. And, you know, I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and as they think about the world that they're inheriting from us, we have these kind of conversations around the house of what can we do, what should we be doing? And honestly, it comes down to, is it really plastic straws that's going to make the difference when we look at these sorts of changes? It feels like sometimes we're told, hey, there's these little things we're supposed to be doing, like recycling or taking a cold shower, but is that the big thing? So that's why I'm so excited to have Dr. Michael Mann with me today. Mike is one of the world's leading climate scientists and public voices on science communication. He is a Presidential Distinguished Professor of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania and author of Our Fragile Moment, How Lessons from Earth's Past Can Help Us Survive the Climate Crisis. A longtime target of climate denial campaigns, Dr. Mann has become a powerful advocate for scientific integrity and civic courage in the face of disinformation. His work explores how narratives of fear, outrage, and apathy shape public understanding and how we can move toward collective agency instead of despair. He's also the author of The New Climate War and The Hockey Stick in the Climate's War, and his writings has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Scientific American. Mike, welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, you know, I love having experts like you on this show to have these kind of conversations of what can we do in our personal lives, what should we be advocating for on a societal level. But let's just start with, why climate? Like, was that kind of at the beginning of your career? Was that what you dove into, or was it something that kind of emerged as you grew in your science and communication background?
Yeah, so, you know, I started out sort of in high school. I was a science nerd. I loved math, computer programming, went off to UC Berkeley to study math and physics, then went off to graduate school at Yale University to pursue a PhD in geology and geophysics. To pursue a PhD in physics, and in particular theoretical physics. And I realized that my heart wasn't really quite in it. I wasn't excited about the sorts of problems I was being given to work on. And so I then actually looked around to see where else on campus there was research going on where I could use the skills, the math and physics skills that I had, to work on a problem that I found, you know, really interesting and important. And I saw that there was a professor in the Department of Geology and Geophysics, Barry Saltzman, who was using math and physics to model Earth's climate system. And so I decided, hey, that sounds interesting. Went and talked with him, ended up doing my PhD with him, and that led me down this road of climate science and pursuing questions, ultimately, the warming that we're seeing. How unusual is it in a long-term context? Those sorts of questions led to an answer, the so-called hockey stick curve, that demonstrates just how profound the warming of the past century or so is. You know, this warming spike that we see is unprecedented as far back as we were able to go 1,000 years. It coincides with the Industrial Revolution, with the increase in greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning. And I ultimately found myself a target of climate deniers and the bad actors who sort of promote climate denial because our findings were a threat to them. Our findings laid bare the reality and threat of climate change. And so I found myself under attack, decided that I had to push back, I had to fight back. And that's where I entered into the realm of communication. It was in the process of trying to defend my work and to defend climate science from these attacks that I sort of realized I had a platform. I had a platform that I could use to try to inform this conversation about what's arguably the greatest challenge that we face, the climate crisis. And that's how I arrived where I am today.
Now you talk about that weaponization and disinformation and attacks on you. I'm wondering, from a personal perspective, how did you get through that? And then we'll kind of go to more the collective public trust and those big picture things. But just personally, did it surprise you? Was it how did you emotionally handle that?
Yeah, so, there's nothing in your scientific training that prepares you for that. Scientists aren't trained to do combat in the public sphere, to engage with bad faith actors who aren't interested in truth, but are just looking to try to discredit you for ideological reasons or financial reasons. And so it's sort of trial by fire. You're sort of out there. You have to learn how to communicate because the best way to fight back against the attacks is to be an effective communicator. I realized that early on. One thing that was really important to me early on, I was a young postdoctoral researcher, sort of pillars of the scientific community like the great Stephen Schneider, who was a leading climate scientist and a leading climate science communicator at the time, came forward, reached out to me, and provided me help and tried to help me understand why I was being attacked in this way. That this isn't about you, it's about the threat that your work presents to some very powerful vested interests, the fossil fuel industry. That allowed me to, in a sense, to depersonalize it, to realize it was about something bigger, and defending my work and pushing back and fighting back was really about defending the science against a bad faith, these bad faith attacks. And I realized ultimately that it was a privilege to be in a position, again, to inform this conversation. And so I think to the extent I was able to internalize this sort of, to contextualize what was happening to me and to realize it wasn't just about me, it was about something bigger, and that what I was fighting for was something bigger. I think that was really important. It's something that I've tried to share now with younger scientists who've come into the field, sometimes find themselves subject to the same sorts of attacks. To some extent, I feel like I can play the role that some of my mentors played decades ago, mentors like Steve Schneider.
I know in Our Fragile Moment, you write about how Earth has survived past crises, but never with us in the driver's seat. What do you think can teach us about resilience and responsibility today?
Yeah, so that was my last book before the Science Under Siege. It was a very different kind of book. It was really about the science, what we can learn from Earth history going back literally billions of years, and studying past climate episodes, what drove them, and what that it tells us about sort of the nature of the climate system, which obviously informs our understanding of human-caused warming today. And when you study the climate record over these eons, over these very long time scales, you see episodes that convey resilience. To some extent, there's a certain resilience in the Earth system, and that can be comforting. It sort of tells us that we're not yet past the point of no return. We're still within that sort of zone of resilience. But there is also evidence of fragility. If you push the system too hard, too fast, there are past episodes that show it can sort of spin out of control. And so I think what a study of climate change over Earth history, over billions of years, tells us is that, there's both. There's resilience and there's fragility. And what we need to do is to stay within that zone of resilience, to stay within our adaptive capacity. If we continue to warm the planet at current rates, we will leave that zone of resilience. And so that was sort of the lesson of the book. There was also a lesson, and it's a phrase that I repeat often, urgency and agency. It's so important to pair these things, for us to have a sense of the urgency of acting now before it really does become too late to avert the worst consequences of climate change, and the agency that we do have in addressing this problem. Too often, we lose that sense of agency. People fall into despair and doomism, and that's not helpful. It leads us down this path of disengagement, which is what those bad actors want.
Yeah. I was going to ask about that. How do you communicate that urgency without triggering despair and that fatalism? Because I think that you just look at the flooding that happens. I mean, many people I've interviewed on here, we talk about, how much news can I take in? Because it just feels like there's so many things going on. How do you actually communicate that urgency without triggering that feeling of despair that people often fall into?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, and it's true. We face so many challenges today. It's not just the climate crisis or pandemics. It's disinformation, which paralyzes us, which makes it difficult to respond. That's sort of a message of my new book with Peter Hotez, Science Under Siege, that we're dealing with all of these simultaneous challenges. And it can feel overwhelming, and we can lose that sense of agency. Sometimes it's useful to just sort of focus in on one particular problem. And to paint a path forward as to how we can make progress, and that's typically, for me, it's the climate crisis. I mean, yeah. I'm not necessarily an expert with respect to all of the challenges we face societally, but I am an expert when it comes to climate, and I can talk with some authority about it and what we need to do. And one of the things that a rich understanding of climate science tells us today does speak to this. It speaks to both the urgency and the agency. The urgency is that, we predicted that the planet would warm this much as it has. The models were actually remarkably skillful in their predictions of future warming, and we're seeing the consequences. ExxonMobil, in their own internal documents that they hid back in 1982, ExxonMobil, world's largest publicly traded fossil fuel company, their own scientists said that we would see potentially catastrophic events if we continued on this path. And we're seeing those catastrophic events. Recently, of course, this landfalling hurricane in the Atlantic, possibly the strongest hurricane we've ever seen in the Atlantic that made devastating landfall on Jamaica, wildfires out west, the floods in the southeast. We're seeing those potentially catastrophic events. And that's the urgency. It will all get worse if we continue to warm the planet. That's the urgency. The agency is we can prevent it from getting worse. And the science actually informs that. What the science of the last decade or so has told us is that the warming of the planet, the warming of Earth's surface, stops pretty quickly after we bring carbon emissions to zero. We used to think that the planet would continue to warm up for decades, even if we stopped the carbon pollution. And we now understand, because we're able to more comprehensively model the system, and in particular the role of the oceans and its ability to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, we now know that the planet stops warming almost precisely when we bring carbon emissions to zero. And all of the impacts that are tied to that warming stabilize. And so there is this immediate and direct consequence of our efforts to decarbonize our economy. And that's the agency.
Mm. Something always comes up when you're running a private practice. Well, Gusto's payroll and HR services can make it a little easier. Gusto was designed for you, the small business owner. They take the pain out of running a business, automatically calculating paychecks, filing payroll taxes, setting up open enrollment. Gusto does it all. Want more? Time tracking, health insurance, 401k, onboarding, commuter benefits, offer letters, access to HR experts. You get the idea. With Gusto, you can focus on the joy of running your business. It's super easy to set up and get started. And if you're moving from another provider, Gusto can transfer all the data for you. It's no surprise 99% of businesses said the value they get for Gusto is worth the price. And here's the best part. Because you're a listener, you get 3 months totally free. All you have to do is go to gusto.com/Joe. Again, that's gusto.com/Joe. I'm telling you, you're going to love Gusto. Get started today. Now, I want to go back to disinformation, which you talk about in your new book. What have you discovered that maybe the average person doesn't know, whether it's in techniques or in approaches for disinformation? The amount that you dig into disinformation and just the, siege on science, it's just, would love to know, what did you discover in that process of writing the book?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And it is something that it's something I'm very interested in. One of the hats that I wear here at Penn, I direct the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. And so it's really about communication and the art and science of communicating science in terms that are understandable and in ways that are effective and that do sort of help create an environment for progress. And part of that is making sure people understand that it is not too late, that we can still make a difference. And the science speaks to that, as we just discussed. When it comes to fighting misinformation and disinformation in particular, disinformation being intentional misinformation, the social science literature actually, speaks to this. There are quite a few interesting findings in our group within this center, the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and Media. We have postdoctoral researchers who are doing research in the science of climate communication and trying to understand, for example, what the misconceptions are and what techniques are most useful in dislodging those misconceptions. And I use dislodging intentionally because one of the challenges here is that the other side, as it were, the bad actors who are promoting this disinformation, and in the new book, Science Under Siege, Peter and I lay it out. It's petrostates, it's plutocrats, it's the pros and propagandists who sort of help disseminate the disinformation, and in many cases the press as well. You'll note the alliteration there. I'm sort of a sucker for alliteration. So what it shows, what the research shows, is that you have to not only dislodge these very sticky, and when I say sticky, the other side, the propagandists on the other side, are skilled in the art of rhetoric, and they know how to craft talking points that are very sticky, that are simple, and that get lodged in people's brains. And once they're lodged in the brain, it's difficult to dislodge them. To dislodge them, you have to refute the argument, but you have to replace it with something that's as or even stickier. And so that involves just being clever, drawing upon sort of the science of communication and knowing what sorts of techniques are useful for creating sticky notions. Alliteration, I just talked about, is one of those techniques. Metaphor and simile is really important as well. These were lessons that were taught by the ancient Greeks, and they're really important for us understanding how we can not only dislodge the misinformation and disinformation, but replace it with something even stickier. This is sometimes called inoculation. Inoculation is the art of actually, inoculation is a little different. That's another sort of important technique here, which is once those talking points, those memes, become lodged in the brain, as I said, they're very difficult to dislodge. So what you want to do is sort of preempt that possibility by inoculating people, by explaining to them in advance, hey, you're going to hear climate deniers claim A, and here's why that isn't true, and here's what's actually true. Then you've inoculated them so that by the time they encounter that deceptive talking point, they're already conditioned to reject it and to contextualize it and to hopefully recognize, what the science actually says and what it really means.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm wondering, you said that as soon as we go to carbon zero, the Earth bounces back pretty quickly. We got Mike and Joe here. What can we do to help that happen? Not being a politician, yes, we have somewhat of a media platform between what you do and what I do, but what can the average person, the average therapist actually do to move towards getting back to some sense of not moving towards catastrophe?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And, and I think this is the right audience for that question. Therapists, analysts, psychologists. There are a few here at Penn. I've had great conversations with them because one of the things that they're encountering is sort of climate anxiety, climate despair. It's a phenomenon now, and psychologists are actually, clinical psychologists have patients who come to them with this, especially younger folks, sort of Gen Zers. Understandably, they feel the weight of all of these challenges and crises that we're facing today. And none is more pervasive and scary than the climate crisis because it's sort of locked in and it has huge consequences for the world that our children and grandchildren will grow up in. And the younger you are, the more consequences you're going to experience. So again, I'll draw upon this sort of framing of urgency and agency. And again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, but based on my own experiences, if you explain to people the agency that they have, it can help them out of that pit of despair. But it's got to be convincing. You've got to paint a real way forward. And it sort of gets into this other question you're alluding to, like what are the actions you can actually take that make a difference? The actions that make the most difference are policy, right? Are governmental policies that incentivize non-carbon energy, that disincentivize fossil fuels, that move us towards clean energy. And as individuals, we can't put in place the policies that will help collectively move us all in that direction. But we can participate in collective action, which can take the form of demonstrations and protests, and of course, voting for politicians who will institute the policies that are necessary, rather than politicians who will be a rubber stamp for these bad actors, for polluters. And recently we saw that when people turn out in elections, they can make a difference. There's a ray of hope that we still have agency with regard to our ability to impact policy by electing politicians who will do right by us. So that's part of the sort of the individual action that's important, participating in collective action, because what is collective action but the collective behavior of individuals. But there are also, those other things that you talked about, plastic straws and recycling and all of these, things we're told to do. There's always a danger that, and I talk about this in The New Climate War 2 books ago, which is about some of the tactics that the bad actors are using. And one of them is deflecting attention away from the need for systemic change and making it about individual action. Hey, it's your fault. And the only way it's going to change is by you changing your behavior. We don't need carbon pricing. We don't need policies that will, favor clean energy. You just need to be a better individual. It's a deliberate tactic that's been used in bad faith by corporate actors for decades. We saw that with the beverage industry decades ago. They wanted to defeat bottle bills, which were a systemic solution to this growing, global plastic crisis. And instead, they ran a national advertising campaign about how you just need to pick up your bottles and cans. In the fossil fuel industry has run with that playbook. And so we hear so much about how you have to change your lifestyle as if that's all that has to happen. And look, we should do those things, right? Many of the actions that we take to reduce our impact, our environmental impact, our climate impact, make us feel better about ourselves. They set a good example for other people. They often make us healthier or save us money. So we should do those things. And sometimes doing the little things sort of puts you on a path of engagement. Hey, that felt good. What else can I do? And I think there's some, literature in the psychological there's psychological literature that suggests that that's the case, and so we should do those things. They're helpful. What we can't do is allow polluters to convince us that's all we need to do. It can't be a substitute for the big systemic changes that are necessary and that can only be enacted by our policymakers representing us rather than the polluters.
Mike, what do you wish therapists would do in regards to this topic?
Well, I have the sense that that the community is dealing with it, and it's becoming more and more pervasive because young folks, especially Gen Zers, I see it with the students that I teach. As I said before, they feel the weight of everything that's on them right now, and of course, the climate crisis is right in the center of that. So what I would say is, I'm not going to advise therapists as, how to do their work in the same way I wouldn't want them to tell me how to do climate science. But what I would say is there are some lessons from the science and from our efforts to communicate the science, some of the lessons that we've talked about here. And one of them, obviously, that's relevant here is this sense of agency. And a false sense of agency isn't helpful. Pollyannish sort of sunny optimism without any foundation isn't helpful. I think people see through that. I don't think it's effective. So it's got to be grounded in truth. And in this case, there is grounding for that. It's very important for people to understand that the science tells us that we can prevent this from getting worse if we stop burning fossil fuels and, generating ever larger amounts of planet warming carbon pollution. We can still make a difference. It's not too late to maintain a livable planet. That's what the science actually says. Again, Steve Schneider, who was this mentor of mine, who sadly is no longer with us, years ago, he had these aphorisms that I often draw upon. And one of them was, the truth is bad enough. If we just speak the truth about what the science says, that is more than adequate to justify urgent action. We don't have to exaggerate to the point where we potentially play into this sense of despair and hopelessness if we make it sound like it's an unsolvable problem. So I think those facts are relevant for therapists who find themselves, contending, especially with younger folks who've fallen into this pit of despair, of climate despair.
Before my last question, I want to know what keeps you optimistic, Mike.
Yeah, it's just, it is the young folks. I get to see them, talk with them, teach them every day, and they inspire me. They are just so savvy about the world. They understand the challenges, and at least the students that I get to teach and advise here at Penn are passionate about making a positive difference in the world. It's infectious in a good way to me to be surrounded by that. And if I can help, sort of convey some of that infectiousness in my own outreach efforts, then I'm happy to do so. So that's really I draw upon, it's almost the energy that feeds me, is the passion and grounded optimism of young folks who want to make a better world for themselves and for future generations. Anything we can do to help them do that, we have to be doing.
Dr. Mann, the last question I always have is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
Yeah, maybe we've already sort of answered that question, right? The importance of pairing the urgency and the agency. I think that's central to this challenge.
So awesome. If people want to get your new book, if they want to follow your work, where should we send them?
Well, my website is michaelmann.net, and there's links to books I've written, including the new book. I'm on social media, Michael E. Mann, on what I still call Twitter, and Blue Sky, Michael Mann. I'm at Blue Sky. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Mastodon, and I'm on Threads. I think I've named them all. And YouTube. I've got a YouTube channel too.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thank you, Joe. It was wonderful. Really enjoyed the conversation.
As we build our businesses, to think about not just, having a thriving practice we absolutely love. That love side is making the world better. That could be one client at a time. That could be your community. That could be the entire globe or universe. Figuring out for us, what is that impact we want to make on the world beyond just our individual work in our private practice? Is such an important question for us to ask ourselves. And so wherever this podcast hit you, I hope you take some action. I take away some urgency and some agency. That's such a great way that Mike framed that. And as you've probably been following, I am starting a counseling practice from scratch. Great Lakes Online Counseling is what I'm launching. And so I'm going to be hiring some W-2s as part of that, some therapists to join the practice. So when I do that, I'm going to be using Gusto. So Gusto is what we use here at Practice of the Practice. It's the online payroll and benefits solution for small businesses. It's all-in-one, remote-friendly, and super easy to do all those confusing tax filings. I was actually meeting with my bookkeeper the other day, and she said, just use Gusto for the new practice. It's not worth it to run any of this on your own. So head on over to gusto.com/Joe. Again, that's gusto.com/Joe to get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.